Hey guys, how's it going? Paul Harris here. Now, I feel like I've moved around quite a lot since starting my career in accounting and finance. Not only did I begin my career as an auditor, so naturally moved from client side to client side, but I also changed offices whilst at PwC and then subsequently moved on from PwC to two different types of industry roles. As I have experience, I thought I would make a video today talking about the hardest part of moving into a new finance and accounting industry role. Hopefully this will be helpful to some of you out there who are considering moving into finance and accounting role, particularly if you do not have any current accounting experience. So it should give you some indication of what you're getting yourself in for. So with that being said, if this is something that interests you, let's get into it. So if you watched any of my other videos, you'll probably know that I was an auditor, I worked at PwC, I then moved on to a different company where I worked as a FP&A finance analyst, then I worked as a commercial business partner. Speaking from experience and talking to the colleagues over the year, I have an understanding of what you're sort of getting yourself in for when you're going into a different sort of industry accounting role. And these are some of the things that you might want to consider before making a move. So it is worth saying at this point in time that if this is your first accounting role in an industry position and you are not qualified as a qualified accountant, instead you may be leaving university or considering a different industry change and thought that you might want to be studying towards being a qualified accountant, then it goes without saying that one of the biggest and largest challenges is going to actually being able to understand what the accounting principles are and, quite frankly, understanding what anyone is talking about within the finance department. Generally, people that I have worked with over the years have a very good grasp of accounting concepts. It's like another language to them. So if you have qualified and have more than 5 years experience, you'll just know the stuff. However, if you're new to it, moving into a new team, don't have a lot of experience, it might be tricky for you to catch up. What's more, if you are trying to study towards, say, the CIMA or ACCA, whilst being in an industry role, from what I can see, most companies put the emphasis on you to book your own exams and give you very little time to study in your own time. So like you basically have to book the time off yourself if you want enough time to revise. So as a result of this, you have to be pretty determined to revise in your own time, take the evenings to work. And that means you have to be quite self-motivated and you have to book your own exams, which means you have to be persistent to plow through the material to get the knowledge you need to get those exams done. Obviously, this will therefore add another level of pressure to actually moving into a new role. You'll firstly be trying to understand what's required of that role and then further understand what is needed to pass your exams. However, assuming you have passed your exams and have a good grounding of accounting and finance, what other difficulties may you find? Well, one of the first things you're going to find in a finance role is that you have to try and understand the numbers. Numbers tell a story, but in order to be able to understand what that story is, you need to actually be able to ask people from across the business. Now, you're working in a back office role, you're having to ask people who work in a front office role or like sales and other kind of departments to try and understand what has moved within their departments that have caused the numbers to change the way they have. Now, the problem is that your role is going to be completely different probably to the role that they're doing in a lot of finance roles. So they're probably not that bothered to want to deal with you. They have other jobs that they need to be doing themselves, other workloads. So just the people aspect of a finance role is quite challenging. You'll be putting additional work onto them if you're sending them emails to find out why things have moved within their department. Since moving into actually a commercial business partnering role, there is a lot more give take. If you're providing them information, then they're more willing to give you information and it sort of works more harmoniously. But in some finance roles, you're really just asking for information all the time. And it can be quite demanding since they have a different job that they need to be getting on doing. And if people aren't compliant in helping you, then all you're really left with is a bunch of numbers that doesn't really mean anything. So that's a challenge, of course. And you will obviously have members of your team that will be able to help you with why things have moved historically. However, this is another challenge, is that you might just be complacent and rely on the information that you've previously been told. And in some cases, it might be sufficient enough. However, in most cases, it probably isn't. And you'll find that your job's a lot easier once you start building up a network of people from across the business. However, unfortunately, this can take months of time, maybe it's like 6 months for you to properly understand who is going to be able to provide the information for this and who's going to be able to provide the information for that. So although accounting seems like a very number-driven business, there is a very human aspect in industry. And And given that there's a human aspect, that's obviously a challenge that comes with it. Another problem when you start at a company and in an accounting role is that you most probably will not have system experience. So whether this is PBF, Hyperion, HFM, Oracle, SAP, Sage, the list goes on, quite literally goes on and on in terms of the systems you can work with. And these systems are just the front-facing accounting systems. You'll probably also need to know exactly how the information feeds into these systems. Do invoices feed in through systems using Rapid, then AVI to link information to a CPS, and etc., etc. Now, it is incredibly annoying to have to learn all this stuff. Most of the time, people just use the acronyms without having any idea of what they mean, and generally speaking, everyone has a kind of idea of what systems do what. And so it's quite difficult to ascertain exactly what the systems do when you're starting out at a company. So it can be quite painstaking to try and learn these systems. Another problem is that I don't know when people design these accounting systems, whether they knew that accountants would be using them and therefore just made them extremely primitive and time-consuming and not very self-explanatory to use. But compare them to, say, like a straightforward and colorful system that sales and marketing teams use. It's often just not very user-friendly. It's nothing like an Apple product, for instance. It's very painstaking. Often at times you have to learn one system to then be able to use another, and there's so many limitations on what you can actually do. So the system problem is another thing that you're going to come into when you start into a finance role, where you might just not have to deal with as many systems if you're in other certain departments and not in finance. Another thing I find with accounting roles, and I don't know if this applies to other roles across the business, but it is often very hard to know exactly what your full role entails. It starts off by looking like one area that they've described in an interview, but then, particularly if you're new, you seem to just be given loads of little tasks all the time from people from your team because they knew you were going to start that role, so it just sort of built up a list of all the stuff that they maybe didn't want to have to do themselves. And it's very sort of like a churning process at the beginning in terms of getting through to the more interesting kind of work. And at the beginning, you're probably not going to find the work that interesting. And it's time consuming. And this is only made worse when you get to month end. Now, month end is a term most accountants will know very well. It is basically at the end of each month, so the last couple of working days of each month, and it will carry on until, say, the 7th working day of the following month. Depending on the company, could be a ridiculously busy time, as this is the time where you are collating and reporting the results internally to the business. Also, depending on the department, if you're in controllership department, you could be posting accruals, closing ledgers, and in very large companies, or if you're in head office, you could be actually reporting them externally every quarter and every year. So particularly at the end of each year and the end of each quarter, it could be very manic. What this means is you pretty much, in a finance and accounting role, could often find yourself in a position where you can never take holiday at the start of each month and at the end of each quarter and at the end of each year, which can sometimes be quite annoying, particularly when it's on the break of certain, holiday periods. And it's just very busy, and everyone talks about in accounting and finance how there's long hours. Now, long hours are kind of synonymous with accounting practices. And in most parts, you can get some really bad jobs where there are some horrendous hours all the time. However, I tend to find in a lot of the roles I've had and what I can see from around the office, there's generally very busy at times, but then in other times of the month, there are quieter times. So it's basically up and down. It works kind of cyclical. However, if you're not into that kind of thing, you'd rather just a steady flow of work. It can be quite challenging when some days you just have to work long hours. And there's sometimes, I don't know, it's just something in finance where it seems like people just love to work all the time. And you can often get that depending on your manager. So to recap, here's some of the things I just covered. Learning the accounting information is a pain in the neck, particularly passing the exams if you're new to accounting, and finding the time around doing your actual work and learning your job, Also creating the connections from across the business. You need to know a lot of people from the business to actually understand the information and get the information you need. Negotiating to get this information from colleagues who just don't have the time to pass you the information, which can often be very challenging. Understanding all the systems that the company uses, understanding and getting a grasp of the quantity of work that can be quite extensive and lead to long hours, even worse at month end, quarter end, year end. Things can get very busy and time consuming. And to be honest, there are plenty more things that I could mention. It largely depends on the sort of person you are, whether these things can throw you off. I think in finance, there is a tendency to throw people in the deep end, and you may find yourself very early on having to give presentations on information that you just don't really understand and having to repeat verbatim by someone else who has provided you the explanations you need. And this can probably be a very daunting task to some people. You know, my advice here is to just not get overly worried, as it is completely okay to not know the stuff. You know, everyone's been there, and at least you're new to the company. You know, what's worse is when you're 2 years on and you still don't know the information and you're just hoping people don't probe you for questions. You know, this is probably one area where PwC was a lot worse because it's more client facing, and if you don't know your stuff and you go face a client, it's a lot more daunting than a group of your peers who know that you're new. You also have the fact that sometimes information is actually just hard to understand, you know, even further than just the fact that it's accounting information, you might not understand the principles. Now, I'm not saying accounting and finance is rocket science, but there are occasions where there's financial models and information that you're trying to explain that may just not make logical sense to you, and you're trying to work it out, and it can just be very time consuming. There are challenges with the numbers and information, but at the end of the day, that being said, I actually think a role in accounting and finance can be quite rewarding, and often, you know, you are given a level of independence once you get a bit more senior and you know what you're doing. When you can manage a project or you've got a workload, it gives you a certain level of freedom to be able to manage yourself, whereas you may not get that in other departments. So anyway, that's it. Hopefully that's been helpful and informative. If you like this video, subscribe. See you next time. Bye.